Hi everyone, it's Molly Kingsley from UsForThem here. Today I want to talk to you about censorship, in particular because last week the UK's COVID inquiry decided to dip its toe into the topic of censorship and in particular looked at the areas of mis and disinformation and the activities of the UK's CDU, the Counter Disinformation Unit, during the pandemic. I am pretty appalled. So it's a subject that I feel very strongly about. So as some of you will know, I and other UsForThem colleagues found ourselves placed on effectively a government watch list, the UK's counter disinformation units list, for comments that we had made during the pandemic, really advocating for, I would say, sanity and proportion in the pandemic response. Government didn't see it like that. And in addition, in September 2022, UsForThem was debanked by PayPal. And as was reported in press just last week, we now know that that was also because of comments that we had made, in particular about school closures and mandatory vaccinations for children. So it's a subject I feel strongly about, and I think, many of you will feel likewise that actually there was no more sinister aspect to the pandemic than the government's state-led censorship operation. And we watched in horror, certainly I and UsForThem colleagues watched in horror, as for the best part of 2 or 3 years, it was very obvious that terms like anti-vax and mis and disinformation were being weaponised really to close down dissent. So we'd rather hoped that the COVID inquiry might come to it with an open mind. They have, of course, been given copies of the book that we have written, which in part addresses this, and many other materials from us and others who have been impacted by the censorship operation. But sadly, it seems not. And let's have a look at how the inquiry are handling this very important topic. So, in advance of the opening of Module 4, Ben Connor, Secretary to the inquiry, said, "In this module, we'll be looking specifically at mis and disinformation and whether that led to vaccine hesitancy." And a couple of weeks ago, in his introductory address to the inquiry, Hugo Keith KC, he's the lead counsel for the inquiry, said this. He said, "So, my lady, we've asked a number of organisations to explain how the government tackled COVID vaccine mis and disinformation, and we'll be looking at the work of the Counter Disinformation Unit and the Rapid Response Unit. What did they do to address these real problems? We have also obtained evidence from the social media platforms as to how the government interacted with them, and we'll be hearing from the Permanent Secretary at the Department of Culture, Media and Sport about the processes for identifying and acting on such material." And that struck us as a really important and chilling, actually, statement, because what it seems to evidence is that the inquiry is coming to this with a predetermined view, really, that not only was it perfectly appropriate for government and the CDU in particular to monitor and keep track of certain mis and disinformation narratives. I think many of us would have an issue simply with that view, but that actually beyond this, it was appropriate for the CDU to act on those narratives. So, he's asking what did they do to address these real problems? What action was taken? And I think for those of us on the receiving end of this huge state-led censorship operation, and for those of us that saw that actually it was not mis and disinformation being tracked, but in many cases, and I will come on to this, perfectly valid opinions or even facts, simply information, I think many of us would question this whole approach. So one of the witnesses the inquiry called this week was Susanna Story. During the pandemic period, she was a senior civil servant. She was in charge of the Security and Online Harms Directorate that sat within the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. Effectively, she had oversight for the notorious Counter Disinformation Unit, the CDU. And in explaining the role of the CDU, she described mis and disinformation as follows. So she said, Disinformation is defined as the deliberate creation and dissemination of false information which is intended to deceive and mislead. And misinformation is the same, but without the deliberate intent. Now that sounds simple, doesn't it? And I think many of us might concede that on paper at least, you can understand that in the context of a devastating pandemic or other public health emergency, or any emergency for that matter, there may be justification for limiting the spread of intentionally false or intentionally harmful misinformation, i.e. disinformation. But in practice, it all falls down. And it is readily apparent that whatever the technical definitions of mis and disinformation, the state's censorship exercise went far, far beyond what they claimed to be doing. The CDU quite manifestly, and we've got the evidence to prove it, caught a whole load of material that in no way could be said to be either mis or disinformation. And actually, we don't really need to go any further than what the CDU themselves have said about this to see how difficult it is in practice to apply these labels to real-world situations that may incidentally be moving very fast. We have to remember that what is disinformation in 2020, in 2025, may well simply be fact. To give you an example of that, I have here in front of me Annex A. And what Annex A is, this was a document put in front of the COVID inquiry, in fact, by Susanna Story, head of CDU, a couple of weeks ago. And this sets out the kind of COVID, as it says, the COVID-19 anti-vaccine narratives. So i.e. these are the narratives that the counter disinformation unit thought were legitimate to monitor and potentially to flag to the social media companies asking that these posts, propagating these narratives, were taken down. And it's very interesting, isn't it? Because if you look at the summary, what you can see here is a range of narratives, some of which no doubt are misinformation. So, vaccines as a form of population control, for example, I think many of us would question that. However, there are things here which, have certainly their nexus in truth. So, Bill Gates and elites, well, clearly there's a whole load of narratives that have been rather carried away with that, but it is a matter of fact that Bill Gates funds the WHO and that the WHO and its associate organisations are deeply embedded in the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, we've done sessions on that. That is fact. And there are other things here that are fact too. So the UK government will introduce mandatory vaccines. So this document was written in 2020, but, we know the year later, the UK government literally did introduce mandatory vaccines. They introduced them for care homes. They were very close to introducing COVID passports, which are another form of coercive mandatory vaccine. More fact, the vaccine is harmful and ineffective. Well, how do people who have been injured, how do the bereaved of people that have been killed by the vaccine feel about the fact that statement was struck out as disinformation? And then also in paragraph E, the one that I find really sinister, the vaccine has had side effects on those involved in trials. Again, it is hard to see how anyone could have considered this disinformation. There are a wealth of peer-reviewed studies evidencing that the vaccine did have adverse effects on those involved in trials. And clearly to cast any narrative suggesting this as disinformation, well, it's a form of vaccine totalitarianism, isn't it? It's incredibly extreme. And if you extrapolate what it meant that for the period the CDU was in operation, which we have no reason to think was anything other than the totality of the pandemic, we effectively had a completely one-sided view about the safety or otherwise of this product. And surely there are other statements here that, if not fact, one can see how there could legitimately be a broad range of opinion over. So take this one: COVID-19 is actually harmless. Now, that is a very broad brush statement that clearly and manifestly was not true for a great number of people. COVID was very dangerous for some people, particularly the elderly, the vulnerable, the obese. However, what about kids? Well, for the vast majority of kids, COVID was harmless or near to harmless. And again, it goes to the point, you might not agree with the statement, but surely the proper approach is for it to be allowed to be debated. You don't suppress a statement that has elements of truth. That is not how a democracy should work. I think when looking at this, it's important to remember that the flip side, of course, is that whilst these anti-narrative, anti-official narrative positions were being branded by the CDU as mis or disinformation, actually on the other side you had government and the vaccine companies putting out any number of statements which certainly were misinformation, and I would argue in some cases were disinformation about the risks and benefits of the COVID vaccine. And just to bring this to life, really, I just want to look briefly now at what the Counter-Disinformation Unit considered to be mis and disinformation in the context of the rollout of the COVID vaccine to children. I mean, clearly, many of us would say there is no more important context in which it is essential to ensure that information put into the public domain is true, accurate, and not misleading. And again, I think if we look at what the CDU flagged as misinformation, and perhaps more importantly, what it failed to catch, we can see how very one-sided this whole operation is. So I have here my own returns from the Counter-Disinformation Unit. So this is what came back when I submitted a subject access request. It's a little bit like a Freedom of Information Act request to find out what the CDU held on me. And, there's a whole load of stuff here that is, well, first of all, nothing to do with kids' jabs, but also that in no respect can be said to be mis or disinformation. A lot of this is anecdotal fact, a lot of it is comment, is opinion, but in particular as regards the rollout of the vaccine to children, look at these excerpts. So I'd written an opinion piece, in fact, that went into the Telegraph saying healthy children don't need the COVID jab. I'd given a comment to press saying we shouldn't be edging towards something that hasn't been sanctioned by the JCVI. It's building a climate of pressure. I mean, there is just no way that could have said to have been misleading, incorrect, or dangerous. Even more shocking than that, take a look at this. So this is a letter written by over 60 doctors to the MHRA and others, and in that letter, this group of doctors, this was summer 2021, set out a number of serious safety and ethical concerns surrounding the vaccination of children for COVID. And rather unbelievably, we know, because we've seen the returns come back from the Cabinet Office, that letter was flagged by the CDU as disinformation. And I just find that absolutely incredible because, you might not agree with what the doctors were saying, but who are the bureaucrats in the Counter-Disinformation Unit to flag this as disinformation, potentially ripe for censorship? It beggars belief. What makes it even worse is when you then compare it to what government and the vaccine manufacturers were saying about the rollout of their product to children. So at the same time as people such as these 60 doctors were being flagged as disinformants, the pharmaceutical companies, government, elements of the mainstream media have been allowed to consistently downplay the risk of the COVID vaccines and overstate benefits without any kind of accountability or any hope of that being covered by the CDU. Now, that is my opinion, but you don't have to just look to my opinion for it. It is a fact backed up by the findings of the UK's regulator. So the UK's self-regulatory body is called the PMCPA, the Prescription Medicines Code of Practice Authority. And rather stunningly, since the first COVID vaccine was approved in December 2020, the PMCPA has found the COVID vaccine manufacturers guilty of misleading the public in at least 16 separate cases. And you can see here just a summary collated table of the key PMCPA findings on the COVID vaccines, and a few points are worth drawing out. First of all, these findings apply to every major COVID vaccine manufacturer. And secondly, they are really, really serious, and clearly they bear directly on the question of mis and disinformation. So the findings include, findings that the vaccine manufacturers are guilty of misleading the public about the safety of their COVID vaccines, misleading the public about the efficacy of their COVID vaccines, misleading the public by describing their vaccines as safe, allowing the use of misleading adverts for the COVID vaccines to be directed at children, and bringing discredit and reducing confidence in the pharmaceutical industry. So, the COVID inquiry is so focused on this question of vaccine hesitancy, but it is accusing people who oppose the official narrative of stoking that hesitancy. Yet here you have it from the mouth of the industry regulator. The pharmaceutical companies are guilty of bringing discredit on and reducing confidence in the pharmaceutical industry. Why is the COVID inquiry not looking at that? I think the most shocking example of all of the pharmaceutical companies misleading the public, clearly an example which has not been picked up by the COVID inquiry, is the case that we were involved in. So in December 2022, we brought a case in front of the PMCPA in relation to comments that Dr. Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, had made about a year before that. And he had given an interview to the BBC. This was around the time, just before the time that the vaccine was due to be authorised for 5 to 11-year-olds. And in that interview, he had said, and I am quoting here, that there is no doubt that the benefits completely are in favour of doing it, i.e. vaccinating 5 to 11-year-olds with his company's product, the Pfizer vaccine. He didn't mention risks, he didn't mention potential adverse effects, he didn't mention anything apart from benefits. And yet this was not considered disinformation by the CDU. So the whole thing's a joke, isn't it? It's completely one-sided. And sorry, as you can probably see, I'm a little bit angry about this, but I'm angry because, those of us who have been on the receiving end of this operation frankly deserve better. Like, we have been called vaccine skeptics, anti-vaxxers. We've had horrid smear campaigns thrown at us. We were debanked, and we've been accused of reducing confidence in vaccines and in public health. And if you're going to level that kind of accusation at people who were doing their best to urge caution in the face of, what many of us would say was a coercive and unethical vaccine rollout, you, and by you I mean the COVID inquiry, has to look at the role of the pharmaceutical companies and government in also reducing confidence, because it's not going to be restored. The public see this, the public know who is to blame here, and it sure as hell isn't the people who have been trying to stand up to this narrative.